Hi, it's Cathy of Easy Sunday Club, and welcome to my first watercolor tutorial. So we are in the year of 2020 in January, and it's not only the beginning of a new decade, but also the beginning of another lunar New Year zodiac cycle. If you're familiar with the Chinese Zodiac cycle, you know that it repeats every 12 years, and we're actually at the beginning of a new cycle. This year, we are entering the year of the rat, so I thought it might be interesting to do a watercolor tutorial on a rat. I know it's not the most attractive animal to paint in watercolor, but the shapes of a rat is relatively simple compared to, let's say, a giraffe or an elephant. So it's an easy way to ease into painting watercolor animals if you're a beginner and want to learn how to paint in watercolor. So I hope you enjoyed this tutorial, and leave a comment if you have any further questions or have any special animal requests. So I'm going to start this painting with a light pencil sketch. My sketches are usually pretty rough. The idea is just to get the proportions and the general silhouette down so that I know where the ears are, how long the tail is, etc. I'm not trying to fill in any details at this stage. Most of the details are to be filled when I start painting. But when I start painting, I don't have to think about where the body parts are. So I'm painting a profile view of a rat, which is consisted of, it basically looks like a long triangle. And that's kind of my approach with painting or sketching animals, and I try to break it down into shapes. And I also use that approach when I start painting as well. And the nose is going to be somewhere right here. And the ears, I'm going to make the rat a little cuter than, they're kind of cute, but I'm going to make it a little bit like the Ratatouille rat. So I'll make the ears a little bigger when I start painting. But right now I'm just trying to get the rough idea, the positioning down. And the rat's going to have a tail, the arm is kind of on its side in sort of a clapping pose. And there's the eyes here.
It just has to be like a light sketch.
Yeah, very light.
Right. And then after you paint, you're just gonna erase all the lines?
No, I'm using a 2H pencil, so it's pretty light already. And if it's on the light side, sometimes watercolor will cover it. Of course, if the watercolor value is really light, it's not going to cover, but I'm not too worried about not being able to erase the pencil marks. And sometimes even if it's under a layer of watercolor, I would still be able to erase some of it. You just have to make sure that the paint is completely dried. So I'm not sure if the sketch will show up in the video now because it's so light, but we will see. All right, I think we got the general shape down. Can you see on the video there? I just don't want it to look like I'm moving this pencil around on a white piece of paper. Nothing is happening.
Where did you find this picture of the rat?
Stock image, something, iStock photo. Or maybe make the tail go down a little bit. Keep the composition interesting. All right, that's good. And then where's the eyes? Where's the eyes? Oops.
think eyes used to be your like scariest part. When you're afraid that you screw up the entire painting if you
Yeah,
missed the eye. But
so I do that last, but I'm actually gonna start doing it first just because it requires a lot more layering. Oh, sometimes it does. It's often the darkest part of the animal, so either requires a lot of layering or you just have to commit to it with a darker color. All right, so this is the sketch. Next, I'm going to start mixing some colors. Sometimes I plan out the colors, other times I don't. Sometimes I'll do like a swatch. You know, if there's a little piece of paper here, I'll do a swatch with 3 to 4 different colors. But in this case, just for simplicity, I'm going to just mix something on the fly. So I am mixing India red and gray. I use a lot of water, but this is not a huge painting, so I'm gonna have to watch how much water I use. And I was using a size 8 brush, but now I'm gonna use a size 4 because I'm gonna fill in the details first. I'm gonna try something a little different, which is I am going to do the eye first. I don't know if there's a right or wrong way. I know a lot of artists do the eyes first because it is what will make or break the painting, but I also feel like sometimes for me, rest of the painting, how rest of the painting turns out will help me guide how I want to paint the eyes. It might make more sense when I start doing it. So I don't want it to be completely black yet on the eyes, so I'm gonna mix it with a little bit of India red. You know what? Sorry, this brush is too... Right, that's good. Now, kind of define the shape of the... I think this is going to be more of a brown than a gray rat. We shall see. So this is kind of where I'm going to start. I always feel like the first couple of strokes are always the scariest.
do you know what colors you want to make this guy?
It's going to be a grayish brown. What is that? I don't know what it's called. Like a dark grayish.
Do you know what like special accent color you want to do this time?
I don't know if I'll do an accent color. So I'm gonna layer a light color in the lighter areas. So the rat's stomach is almost a, well, it is a white color, but I can't just have white color on this. So I'm layering a very light grayish tone. When watercolor paint dries, it's going to lighten up even more. So I'm not too worried that it looks a little darker than I like right now. You actually want it to look a little darker than the end color, the end value. You can see the way I approach painting. I would start on top and then kind of skip over and go to the bottom. It's a very intuitive process and one that I'm still trying to figure out how to explain to someone else. So be patient. This is my first video. I think eventually I'll get a hang of it and be able to explain my process in a more organized thought process way. I don't know what I'm saying, but for now, I just want to show you kind of my technique. I use a lot of wet on dry here. So on this, the arm is going to be a little, let me do that again. So here I apply a very concentrated paint here on top. And then I rinse the brush a little bit. Yeah, this is where we have to show. So I rinse the brush a little bit and clean off excess water off the brush. And I kind of like trace it along the bottom of where I just applied paint to create that radiant, the gradient effect.
That's what you mean by wet on dry?
That would be wet on wet because I'm touching a wet surface edge with a wet brush. But this is what creates this really pretty watercolor bleeding effect that you can't get from, you know, oil or acrylic, and it's one of my favorite. So it looks like the other parts are almost dried. I would have liked these edges to be a little less aggressive, but they're already dry. There's not much you can do with it. Like I said, I'm kind of just improvising as I go. So here I'm applying another one, and as you can see, that layer was still it wasn't completely wet, but it was damp. So when I applied a layer of paint on it, it started bleeding out to the you know, as far as the damp area goes. And I like that. I like when that happens, even if I'm not completely planning it. So just to make sure I don't get a whole lot of jagged edges, I'm going to fill this part with like I'm not adding enough paint in this. So I feel like the edges are starting to look a little too rough, so kind of rounding it out. And maybe I need a little help from a darker tone. So I'm using, what is this, sepia? Sepia up here. So here I'm applying a sepia and India gray combo paint on the bottom of the rat where it's darkest, because sometimes I consider where the light hits the subject, but I don't always. A lot of my washes are kind of abstract, so in this case I think it makes sense to follow the logic of where the light hits the subject, so I will do that. And then here I just added some more concentrated paint here because what I'm going to do next is, again, I'm cleaning up the brush and excess liquid. You don't have to clean the brush completely from paint, because what I'm going to do next is I'm going to pull the paint that was already wet towards where the tail's supposed to go, again, to create that gradient effect. See, it's, and preferably do it in one stroke, but sometimes your arm, my arm doesn't move the way that I like. There, so let me just pull it all the way so it doesn't have these weird dried edges. And I think that's pretty good. So if you look here, this is the darkest part of the painting besides the eyes, right? Now I have to decide, because it's starting to dry up. Do I want these edges to look like this, or do I want to fill it with more paint? I think I want the edges to look like this. I want this painting to be very minimalist, right? So I'm not always obeying the rules of the shadow and light. And I kind of like that this part is very abstract and geometric. So I'm gonna work on the right thigh, rat thigh. Here, and I'm also now gonna change to a so this brush, I just changed to a size 2 brush. Is it size 2? Yes. And it wasn't carrying enough water, so I dipped the brush in water a bit more to kind of add more paint to the area. And thought, okay, let me just let it dry before I decide what to do next. Right here, the area kind of cuts off a little too aggressively, so I'm gonna add a bit more, and then switching back to a size 8 again. You can see here, so I worked on both legs at the same time, or back to back, and some of the lighter paint from the back thigh is starting to bleed into the front. I really like when that happens, even though realistically, you know, it's not, it doesn't make sense, but this is one of the things I love about watercolor. I may darken the back thigh a little more, the right thigh a little more later, but after it dries completely, just because I don't want to mess with that yet. So let me see. So this part's a little, this part needs some tone. So under the chin, I'm going to apply more color here. And you can see that the head was already completely dry, so when I add another layer, it adds this transparent layer on top of it. All right, and again, this is something I love about watercolor. You can create these definitions just by layering on. It also makes it scary because once it dries, there's not much you can do with it. And I just noticed that this part was bleeding a bit over the edge, and it's creating these jagged edges that I don't like so much. So I know it's almost dried, but you can actually take a wet brush and just keep rubbing on it. Not hard, but you know, rub onto it gently. And use a paper towel too. There. So it looks better than before. And once it dried, it's not going to have this zigzag edge. I'm going to go over the ears again. And for the ears, there's a little bit of shadow behind the ears, so I'm going to create that. Adding another layer. Also need to start making paint or mixing color for the nose. I'm thinking a little bit of flesh. So this is actually a gouache tone. It's a flesh gouache tone by, I think it's by Hobian. I don't know how to pronounce that brand. Starts with the H. That's too much orange. I think I'll just stick with flesh and a little bit of Oprah red. Just a tinge. Oh, that's too much. And maybe just a tinge of the gray that we were just using. Let's fill that up. Now, if I just leave the nose as is like this, it looks a little too cartoonish, so I'll let it dry and add definition to it later. Same thing with the ear. I'm just applying a base layer. This is actually the back of the ear, so it shouldn't be a flesh tone. It should be a lighter grayish color. Why do I keep saying grayish? It's a brownish, it's a reddish gray rat, not grayish. All right, so looks like the right thigh is almost, oh, it's pretty dried. So I can go back and add more shadow to it. And looks like ideally I would have worked on the paws while the legs are still dry, but since I'm gonna be layering on top of it, I'm not too worried about all the dried layers stacking on top of each other and not looking too busy. So I've just extended out the thigh to the beginning part of the paw, you know, where I guess it would be, is that the rat's ankle? um, and I'm gonna take the flesh tone again and just start pulling it out. All right, so in this case, I'm not taking a clean, no, just a damp brush to pull out the paint. I'm using, I've loaded the small a small paintbrush with the flesh color and pulling the reddish gray color, the color of the the rat's body, just so it has that nice transition between the gray or the brown to the paw. And I'm not too worried about defining the paw right now. I just want it to be a good transition, and I'll worry about the end of his paw later. There's something is weird happening here. I think I didn't close off the silhouette, and so I'm adding a bit more color here. It's like it was a little damp, so adding another layer here. Like I said, this is a very intuitive process. The more you do it, the more comfortable you are with adding these layers. And you know, I taught myself watercolor, so it's hard for me to even describe what style this is, but it's the one that I'm most drawn to. And you know, people seem to like it, so the challenge is to translate my intuitive style into words in a way that someone else can replicate. So now I'm going back to the nose since it needs a little more detail. I feel like I might have overdone the nose a bit. Let me see if I can still save it by applying a wet why do I keep saying toothbrush? A wet paintbrush and cleaning off the paint a little bit, the excess nose. I'll leave that for now and re-evaluate after it dries. when I'm not instructing while painting, I tend to paint faster. So I'm not thinking about, not pausing even for a second to think about, well, I am, but I'm not pausing to think about how to explain what I just thought about, if that makes sense. I don't make sense. I just added in the flesh color, apply the flesh paint to the rat's hands, and now I'm trying to see if I want to add another layer to the hand. I like what I did earlier with the gradient here. I really don't want to mess with it, but I feel like the body is a little too light. I also know that I don't want to just darken the whole area. So I want to see how I can break it up into more abstract areas so that I can apply these shapes to it. Okay. Here goes nothing. So I just mix that color again. The brush doesn't have a lot of water, but just enough that if it looks totally ugly, I can wet it and try to save it with a paper towel. So here goes nothing. So this is the underarm area, or where the arm ends. So I'm going to start here where there's some shadow, and I'm going to try to add some layer here. Alright, so it doesn't look too bad. The first layer is still visible, which I liked. But now we're filling in some of this white area that was just a little too empty. And now I'm thinking I need to fill the rest of the rat too. Not fill, but darken the head a bit, because it looks kind of awkward. And keep in mind, everything will lighten once the layer dries, so don't freak out if it looks too... And I'm just reinforcing the first layer. That's something, like a trick that you can do, so you don't feel like you have to commit to the value of the first layer. You can always follow along the edge of an earlier layer just to darken it, even though I've already applied a middle layer. And let's see, the stomach area is okay, but now I feel like this part and this part and this part, they're all too similar, and we need more emphasis on, there needs to be more of a tonal contrast in some parts of the body. So now I'm wondering if I need to darken the back of the rat more. I think I will do that with a little help of sepia. Sepia is not as strong as in dark, intense as black. So I like that. Oh, maybe I should have used a smaller brush. I'm gonna try using a smaller brush here. Back to the two. Sometimes I'm too lazy to switch brushes, so I would use the same size brush for the whole painting. Sometimes I'll even try to paint an eye with a size 8. I don't know what I'm thinking, but sometimes it works, other times it doesn't, and no one else but me sees that painting. So, see, this head here looks a little funny, like someone chopped off a little part of the top of his head there, so I'm going to make sure that the silhouette connects with the upper back area. And also I can fill in his eyes a little bit. Or I can see if I want to make the rat look a little happier, maybe, with a smile. It's like the subtlest thing that can change an expression of a living being. And now I'm going to add a few more definition to the paws.
How long does the painting usually take you?
Anywhere between 20 minutes to an hour and a half, and sometimes I have to step away from it and come back and see things that I couldn't see before. But like I said, I paint faster if I'm not trying to explain it while I'm painting, but it's kind of fun to talk through my process out loud since I never do it. I sound like a crazy person.
You are.
Yeah, I am. Adding a very subtle smile. I think it might be a little too wet, so pulling back. You can see some pencil marks along the edges. I'm not too worried about it. The ones that haven't touched any paint, obviously I can erase them. The ones that are under a layer, I'm not too worried about it either. I'm just not too worried, period. So now I'm looking, and this part is a little weird. I know I want the stomach to look the widest, but I almost feel like this part feels weird that it's not. Maybe I'm gonna try to connect this part with the back more. Sometimes I apply a new layer, I'm like, oh my god, what did I just do? But I have to keep reminding myself that it will get lighter. Once it gets lighter, it won't look so intense. Okay. With the tail, I think the tail needs a little more definition. By definition, I mean just variation in value and dark to lightness. So I'm going to do this. I'm going to use the same trick, which is applying a more concentrated color, and start pulling it on each side to make it, to create the gradient. So I'm going to start somewhere right here where it folds. Clean off the brush and start pulling it this way and this way. So it looks like, where the tail start to curl a little bit, there's more shadow. That looks right. Maybe a little more shadow to the bottom too. Okay. And I'm wondering if this part needs a little help. Yeah, I think that looks better. So applying a sepia India red tone on top of the arm, because I think the arm looked a bit too disjointed. And my last attempt to define the mouth of the rat a little more. This makes me want to watch Ratatouille.
Or eat ratatouille?
Hmm?
Or eat it?
Yes. I don't know when's the last time I've had a Ratatouille. So, I'm trying to think. I do like doing the eyes first. I'm gonna try to do that more. Well, this eye is kind of easy, but there are eyes that's more complicated. So I wanted to soften the edges of the eye a little bit, so I just applied a little. I tried to rub my small wet brush into the top edge of the eyes more, because I felt like it looked a little bit too marbly. I think that looks better. Honestly, at this point, for the sake of this tutorial, I would call it. I can always, with these paintings, I think it's finished when the artist says it's finished. So I would say that it's finished. Okay, I know what's one thing I can add. Are these layers? They're almost dried. What I sometimes like to do is, no, my paintings are not hyper realistic. Like, I'm not gonna fill in every single strand of hair, but I do like to suggest the appearance of hair sometimes, just again in like very abstract way. And I don't want to add too many because it would just, I think it will look too cartoonish. So it's not so much they're even hair. It just adds dimensionality to areas that were too flat or of the same value. Okay, I'm really done with the mouth now. Okay. I think that is good for this. Should we put a little hat on him?
Chinese hat?
Yeah, like the Chinese had the half dome hat. I don't know how it looks like though.
Well, it's a series. You can just Photoshop that on later.
Fine. Well, maybe I'll give him a red envelope. That's easier. If at this point you're like, okay, you're crazy. We are painting for Year of the Rat, so I think it's still relevant. What red am I using? Chinese red envelopes are pretty red. Permanent deep red. I'm using permanent red, deep red. It's a little too red. Adding. Okay. Here goes nothing. So culturally, during this time of the year, we will give, if you're an adult who is employed,
Married.
oh, married, hopefully employed too. It is customary to give red envelopes to people of younger generations, as long as they're not also married. But I think it's okay that they are employed. So it's fine they have a job. Like if your 22-year-old niece is unmarried, you can still give them red envelopes. And to state the obvious, or in case you don't know, we put money, cash money inside these red envelopes. And when we receive red envelopes now for our daughter, we try to squirrel it away for her college fund. I don't have any photo reference of a red envelope, so right now it looks funny, but when it dries, I'll write in the name or the word that, one of the many words that usually go on the red envelope that says prosperity or happiness or money, longevity, something. Oh, you know what? I forgot the most important thing. This buddy needs some whiskers. So, going to add just a few. Okay. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. As I mentioned, this is the first tutorial I've done. It might be a little long, might be some moments of silence, so thanks for bearing with me. We welcome any feedback, and I look forward to doing the next one. Happy New Year! 新年快乐!